Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Lisa Gray. I'm a member of the steering committee of U.S. Architects Declare. And 1 year after our launch on Earth Day 2020, we, U.S. Architects Declare, is a collective of some 400 firms and more than 300 individuals committed to the work of urgently transforming practice from an extractive economy to implementing regenerative, bio-based solutions for the built environment within a framework of justice within our practices and our communities. Today, we will hear from representatives of U.S. Architects Declare about what we've been working on and how we will all continue this work in the coming years. Our mission is to support each other with resources and communication, to advocate within our towns, cities, states, and country for change, and to take concrete actions within our practices and teaching to move quickly toward new ways using regenerative zero carbon methods that are already well known to create the built environment and to protect the non-human life with whom we share our planet. Today, you will hear reports from our 3 working groups, Carbon, Biodiversity, Justice, and then we will welcome Michael Pollan, founder of the United Kingdom Architects Declare, whose launch in 2019 has spawned collectives of architects across the globe who are joined in their commitment to urgent action. Michael will share with us concepts of how to affect systemic change. Today, we will also launch a survey of our signatory firms, and then we will hear closing remarks from steering committee member Shannon Gathings of Duval Decker in Mississippi. Today on Earth Day, millions around the globe are considering how we can move responsibly into the future with care and respect for our planet. We know that change is urgently needed. We know that business as usual will be cataclysmic. I believe that most people are committed to change and want to work to build a fair, inclusive, ecologically regenerative world. Many are understandably confused and worried about how they themselves can affect change. We, though, as designers of the built environment, do have a clear course available to us. We just need to take it. The solutions will not be easy to effect at scale, but they are not mysterious, which means that with commitment and collective will, we have the ability to bend the carbon curve strongly downward within our sector, which, as we know, is responsible for 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. So, thank you for participating in this collective action. The climate, biodiversity, and social justice emergencies with which we are faced are, of course, intersecting and intertwined, and it is only by working on all 3 simultaneously and collaboratively that we can change the course of our future for all people, for all species, for our home, the planet. I will now pass it over to Seth Embry, Debbie Chen, and Nicole Biwinga, who will give you an update on the working groups.
Hi, I'm Seth Embry, and I'm going to introduce the Biodiversity Working Group. In the Biodiversity Working Group, our mission is to accelerate the integration of architects into networks of experts and stakeholders, working to understand and reverse the built environment's destructive impact on biodiversity. We seek to build and normalize a culture of active, effective stewardship of the natural world within our practices. We identify the following 4 routes to effectuate this necessary paradigm shift within design practice: education, strategy sharing, collaboration, and advocacy. In the education focus area, we aim to develop a clear understanding of the built environment's impacts on biodiversity through the creation of a knowledge sharing platform linking design professions to species conservation, resource management, ecosystem services, land use planning, food systems, and other key biodiversity components. Our projects include a faculty biodiversity survey, the intent of which is to better understand the broader landscape of academic engagement with biodiversity issues and to elevate and cross-pollinate such work across education and practice. We have created a short survey for architecture and design faculty and researchers to self-identify by following the link provided in the chat. Our second project is a syllabus workshop. We are interested in learning from syllabi of faculty who are actively incorporating biodiversity issues into their studios and courses. The aim is to explore how educators are amplifying biodiversity in design research, methods, and strategies. Through workshopping, we plan to host public discussions with educators to create a resource for better understanding the implementation of biodiversity in design curricula. Our third project is an annotated bibliography, a reviewed and cross-linked database of essays, books, journals, and other media related to biodiversity content. Our fourth project is an Intro to Biodiversity 101 flowchart, and this is a guide for educating clients and other stakeholders on various entry points and sequences for integrating biodiversity initiatives into their projects. In the strategy sharing focus area, the objective is to highlight design case studies that incorporate biodiversity, as well as to provide links to tools, metrics, design methodologies, technologies, and related resources that enable these exemplary projects to exist. Their projects include a rating system database or criteria for assessing projects. This is a list of rating systems that include credits for biodiversity-related work, including LEED, Sustainable Sites, Living Building Challenge, and BREEAM. The tenets of these systems will be used as criteria for assessing the projects that will be included in the case study library, which is the second project of that focus area. And it's a library of case studies oriented toward practicing architects in small to medium firms organized by relevant criteria. In the collaboration focus area, the aim is to develop collaboration among professional, academic, industrial, cultural, and civic organizations to seed grant opportunities for projects focused on biodiversity enhancement goals. Their projects include a speaker series and symposium that addresses biodiversity within the built environment at different levels and to engage in individuals or organizations doing important work in biodiversity enhancement. A competition planning, to develop and launch a competition with a partner institution to both spread awareness of existing work and accelerate biodiversity enhancement as a core part of future design. Their third project are research grants to identify, develop, and apply for targeted biodiversity research grants and funding opportunities with specific collaborators. In the advocacy focus area, the mission is to shift architects' approach to the built environment by engaging with other advocates, the general public, industry professionals, and policymakers. This will be accomplished by communicating the importance of biodiversity in architectural practice, identifying existing tools, policies, codes, and regulations that work to enhance and/or sustain biodiversity, and responding to new policies and initiatives that affect biodiversity at the local, state, federal, and international level. Their projects include mapping, advocacy, and process and actors, review policy zoning requirements to identify gaps, researching and diagramming structures of governance, and evaluating the cultural lens through which we view nature. Through all of these project initiatives across these four focus areas, our working group intends to integrate and identify the rich and complex network of design professionals and educators working on biodiversity issues, as well as to expand their potential possibilities for interaction and emergent proliferation. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Debbie Chen, and I'm representing the Carbon Working Group. As a working group, our mission is to empower architects to radically decarbonize their projects, but also to advocate for the immediate and sustained decarbonization of the entire building and construction sector. And to those means, this group is focused on assembling and developing strategies, tools, and resources that transform practice. And it's very important to note that these tools are grounded really in the intersection between operational carbon, embodied carbon, but also the broader environmental and social impacts of the buildings that we design. So under that mission, we organized ourselves into four focus areas, which include policy advocacy, decarbonized buildings and construction, retooling design practice, and education and communication. So under those four working groups, we embarked on a collective research and review process. To serve as a living resource for our future projects, we collectively assembled a spreadsheet of references and tools to better establish the link between architectural practice and carbon footprint. And it was very important for all of us to kind of understand the groundwork and to have a baseline knowledge of the resources that we could work with. These references were peer reviewed and analyzed for applicability across a spectrum of user groups and experience levels. And within this large living spreadsheet, we have started collecting materials for material databases, lifecycle analysis calculators, codes, policies, standards, and organizations who are doing important work. So with that living spreadsheet assembled, we are moving on to the communication portion. And the first synthesized project of the Carbon Working Group will focus around the issue of carbon communication. So we decided to list out 6 questions, which will serve as a guideline for us to produce a series of frequently asked questions sheets, quick guides, or playbooks designed for multiple audience perspectives, whether you're a student or an educator, AEC professional or a client, or someone with general interest in the issues of decarbonization. So drawing upon the resources listed in our living spreadsheet, these questions aim to clearly articulate the connection between building industry and climate change, but also to empower each audience group with accessible tools towards decarbonization. So the 6 questions are: why is there urgency? What do buildings have to do with climate change? How do I make the pitch to my client that decarbonization matters, or vice versa? How do I convince my boss or manager that it matters enough to do something on our project? How can I lower the carbon footprint of my projects? How do I perform carbon analysis on my project? How can I advocate for meaningful climate policy? And how can I tie decarbonization to climate justice, health, equity, and all our other concerns? So our hope is that using these 6 questions, we're really returning to what we're declaring as a working group, which is to draw the link between decarbonization and the other intersectionalities between climate justice and health equity and the built environment. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Biwinga, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Social and Environmental Justice Working Group. Recognizing that the climate emergency disproportionately impacts disadvantaged communities, the Social and Environmental Justice Working Group will prompt education advocacy among architects to disrupt systemic inequalities and work towards social justice. We seek to define concrete ways for architectural firms, small and large, to work collectively for the public good every day as follows: to eliminate barriers to the profession, to build healthy communities for all, to build social and civic infrastructures, and to empower community members and institutions. The Education Focus Area. The mission of the Education Focus Area is to curate and present resources related to social and environmental justice and their attendant intersection with biodiversity and decarbonizing within architectural education. Education both formalized at institutions towards degrees and as an ongoing practice of learning as practitioners. This group is working towards a speaker series and workshop to develop architects' engagement with social and environmental justice. While in its early phases, we are hoping to set up a series of workshops that will allow for practitioners to work through how to develop better community relations and address historic inequity in design, and to share the material produced widely through the U.S. Architects Declare website. The mission of the Profession Focus Area is to provide resources, actionable guidelines, tools for implementation, and measurement metrics to practicing architects and designers who aim to reform the professional practice of architecture to be more just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive. We believe that this is a necessary step for our sector to effectively work towards social and environmental justice. The Structures of Practice Matrix maps existing documentation and resources that address a variety of structures influencing the professional practice of architecture that must be redesigned and realigned to better support justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the profession. These structures include licensure, workplace policy and culture, profit, client contracts, and regulations. Zooming in on the structure of workplace policy and culture, we've begun a cross-comparison of existing literature on workplace equity. The aim of the Equitable Practice Index is to synthesize a variety of sources on this topic to arrive at an accessible and actionable framework that can be implemented in architectural practice. The mission of the language subgroup of the People Public Policy Focus Area is to research and record the definitions of relevant words and terminologies surrounding the design field, to study how these terms and definitions have changed over time, to collect the definitions and research of previous studies into a comprehensive and easily searchable database, to provide a range of definitions to users based on their experience, ranging from basic terms and definitions all the way to extended research and related sources. The learning list is intended to be a catalog of words and phrases relevant to the design field and a collection of their definitions. Our intention is that eventually this could become a resource that provides a variety of definitions for terms based on experience, ranging from basic definitions for those just getting started to expanded definitions and related resources for those with more experience. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone from the working groups, for all of your work and for walking us through what you've been working on for the past 6 months. It's really exciting to hear all of that together. It is now my privilege and pleasure to introduce Michael Pollan, who will be giving us a discussion talk on systems for change in architecture practice. It will be followed by a Q&A. I put this in the chat, but please, if you do have any questions that come up during his presentation, drop them in the question and answer box, and I will bring them forward afterwards during the Q&A portion. So Michael Pollan established Exploration Architecture in 2007 to focus on regenerative design. Previously, he was central to the team at Grimshaw that designed the Eden Project. His TED Talk has had over 2 million viewings, and his book Biomimicry in Architecture has been Reba Publications' best-selling title. In 2019, he was involved in launching Architects Declare, which has spread internationally and now has over 5,000 companies signed on addressing the planetary crisis. He is currently working on a number of environmentally progressive projects and has co-authored a co-authored book with Sarah Ichioka, provisionally titled Design Paradigms for a Planetary Emergency. Michael, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for involving me, and thank you also for your commitment to Architects Declare. So the book that Zan just mentioned, I'm actually going to be talking quite a lot about the ideas from that book. So before I get going, I just want to make sure that I credit my co-author, Sarah Ichioka. So she needs to be equally credited for the ideas I'm about to talk about. And we have now settled on a final title, which is Flourish, Design Paradigms for Our Planetary Emergency. And it's very much aimed at the Architects Declare movement. So I'm going to share some slides now. And I'd like to start with this one. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Earthrise photo, which was credited with starting the environmental movement. In some ways, I find this one much more interesting. This was taken by the Cassini spacecraft. As it was passing Jupiter, it turned around and took this photograph of planet Earth. And there we are, isolated in all this vastness. And it's absolutely clear that no one's coming to our rescue. Our fate is entirely up to us. And it also makes me think about the enormity of deep time. And I like the way that Janine Benyus conveys just how young humans are as a species. She encourages us to imagine the history of planet Earth as if it were represented as a calendar year. And then imagine you're a breath before midnight on New Year's Eve, and you're looking back over the course of that year to see what had happened. Well, what you'd find is that the first life forms appeared around March. The dinosaurs emerged in early December. And they disappeared around Christmas Day. Humans appeared barely 15 minutes ago. The whole of recorded history flashed past in the last 60 seconds. In the last 1.5 seconds, we have emitted 500 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. In the last third of a second, that's the time I've been alive, we've extinguished 2/3 of the non-human animal populations on Earth. The truth is, we are hurtling towards extinction if we carry on as we are. But all of us can choose to play a part in turning this situation around. In the last 1/10 of a second, we've mastered solar energy. We have unparalleled scientific knowledge and phenomenal technology. In fact, we have all the solutions we need, but we're not making fast enough progress because we're stuck in old ways of thinking. The Australian writer Tyson Yunkaporta has suggested that the digital revolution could prove to be just a blip in deep time, followed by a 1,000-year cleanup operation. That's a confronting thought, but that's pretty sure to be the result if we carry on as we are. And this graph shows the scale of the challenge that is ahead of us. That is the rate of greenhouse gas reduction that we need to achieve if we're to stay within a safe limit of 1.5 degrees. So that's a rate of change completely unparalleled in human history. And for me, October 2018 was really a turning point. This was when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued their latest report. And as I'm sure you all know, this was a really stark warning that we are heading for near-term collapse unless we radically change what we're doing. And Sarah Ichioka, my co-author, and I, we've argued in our book that this ought to be a major turning point for architecture as well. And cultural commentators like to pinpoint specific moments in time when shifts occurred. And some say that the Anthropocene, the geological age in which humans became a geophysical force, started on the 16th of July, 1945, when an atomic bomb was detonated for the first time. And that cloud of radioactive particles that spread around the globe, that'll be detectable for the rest of planetary history. And here's a moment in time that is very familiar to architects. Charles Jenks argued that this was the moment that modernism died. So the 16th of March, 1972, when the Pruitt-Igoe housing blocks were demolished. And Sarah and I, in our book, we argue that this date, the 10th of October, 2018, was equally monumental in its own way. This was the day that sustainability died, at least sustainability as conventionally practiced. So the 10th of October was when this building, the Bloomberg headquarters, was awarded the highest prize in the UK, the Sterling Prize. And this was just 2 days after the IPCC report. Now, is this a bit unfair? Well, it's not a bad building. In fact, there are lots of interesting things about it. But by the architect's own admission, this building is consistent with a 3 degrees C temperature rise. So if all buildings were built like this, it would result in a 3-degree temperature rise, which is more than enough to collapse our societies. And bear in mind that this building had an excellent architect, a philanthropic client, Michael Bloomberg, a huge budget, and was claimed to have the highest BREEAM rating ever. BREEAM is the UK equivalent to LEED. So it was clear from this that conventional sustainability is simply not working, and we need to do some really serious rethinking. And in many ways, the last 30 years, painful though it is to accept, the last 30 years of sustainability have been a disaster. More than half of humanity's total historical greenhouse gas emissions have occurred since sustainability entered the mainstream with the publication of the 1987 Brundtland Report, Our Common Future. And continuing with broadly similar behavior will not address the emergency situation. So how should we respond? Well, it was around this time that I reread one of my favorite essays. So this is Leverage Points by Donella Meadows. And she was an absolutely brilliant systems thinker. And in this essay, she argues that because systems are inherently complex, it's not always obvious where to intervene to bring about the change you want. And she lists 12 places to intervene in a system. And I remember the first time I read it, I was quite surprised that some of the things I thought were influential, like, subsidies and standards and exemplars and so on, were a long way down the list. And right at the top, in terms of influence, are changing the paradigm or mindset out of which the system behavior emerges, and changing the goals of the system. So I concluded that what I had been working on for the previous 10 years, which was really trying to create exemplars, simply hadn't worked. And that what I needed to do was to collaborate with others to try and bring about some paradigm shifts. So I embarked on 2 new projects. And one of those was the book with Sarah Ichioka, and the other emerged from an evening in the pub with an old friend of mine, Steve Tompkins. So Steve Tompkins is an absolutely brilliant architect. He's one of the founders of a firm called Howth Tompkins, and they're working on a performing arts center at Harvard at the moment. So we met for a rather gloomy pint of beer in November 2018, and we were talking about the IPCC report and what seemed like a very little response from the UK architectural community. And over the course of that evening, the idea of Architects Declare emerged. We were talking about where each of us had agency. We were talking about Donella Meadows' essay. And that gathered momentum over the next months, and we launched Architects Declare in May 2019. And I'm going to come back to say more about Architects Declare specifically at the end. But right now, I want to return to the theme of paradigm shifts. Now, it's becoming more and more widely accepted that we need to move from a paradigm of sustainability to one of regenerative design. And the architect Bill Reed from the Regenesis Group has been working in the area of regenerative design for a long time. And this diagram from Bill Reed, I think, conveys the story very effectively about why we need to make this shift. So this describes different levels of environmental design, and right at the bottom is conventional practice, which could be characterized as one step better than breaking the law. Above that is green design. So that's the realm of LEED and BREEAM and so on. So relative improvement. And then above that is 100% sustainable, which Bill McDonough has amusingly described as 100% less bad. And the problem with this is that anything less than 100% sustainable is really just part of a degenerative cycle. I've worked in sustainability for nearly 30 years now, and it was really painful for me to realize that a lot of the time when I thought I was making things better, I was really just making things less bad. And so one way or another, we need to get above that line of neutrality into the realm of regenerative design. And just as there was a really lively debate in the early stages of sustainability about what the ultimate in sustainability meant, now I think there's a really valid and topical debate to be had about regenerative design. What is the ultimate and how do we get there? Because I think how we get there is far less clear. I mean, I think this makes the case that we do need to achieve net positive. That's what we need to be aiming for in everything we do. But how we get there is much less clear. And one thing is for certain, that regenerative design is not just sustainability tried harder. It's not just the sustainability paradigm with all the bolts tightened up more. And in my book with Sarah Ichioka, we're arguing that actually we need to bring about 5 really quite substantial shifts. And it starts with defining a new deep purpose for the profession. And we've concluded that this new purpose for us as designers is to facilitate the flourishing of all life for all time. Our purpose is not to build monuments in marble or towers in the desert or to have extravagant buildings shown in glossy magazines. Our ancestors won't thank us for that. Our new purpose is to facilitate the flourishing of all life for all time. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment now. And the first shift that we describe in our book is how to maximize our agency. And by that, I mean our capacity to bring about change. How do we maximize our agency towards this new purpose? The first part of that is seeing that change is possible. Some people assert that questioning our current economic system is madness and believe that conventional capitalism is the only show in town. But consider this. Our economic system has changed twice in the last 100 years, first to Keynesianism and then to neoliberalism. It's perfectly possible to imagine that it could change again, especially when we see the scale of the emergency. The challenge now is to shape a market economy that is consistent with planetary boundaries. And the most persuasive model I'm aware of is Kate Raworth's donut economics. So change can and does happen. It's just easier to see in retrospect. In recent years, we've had major changes in our attitudes towards smoking, towards drink driving, towards equal marriage, and many other issues. The second part is understanding how change happens. And here's a thought from the polymath, Brian Eno. He says, humans are capable of a unique trick, creating realities by first imagining them, by experiencing them in their minds. When Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream," he was inviting others to dream it with him. Once a dream becomes shared in that way, current reality gets measured against it and then modified towards it. As soon as we sense the possibility of a more desirable world, we begin behaving differently, as though that world is starting to come into existence, as though, in our minds at least, we're already there. The dream becomes an invisible force which pulls us forward. By this process, it starts to come true. The act of imagining starts to make something real. So in simple terms, what Eno is saying is that part of bringing about change is working out what kind of future we want, articulating it and repeating it more clearly and forcefully, then embodying it in the work we do, sharing that knowledge and doing it again better. And here's another one that's from Donella Meadows on how to change paradigms. She says, you keep pointing at the anomalies and failures in the old paradigm. You keep speaking and acting loudly and with assurance from the new one. You insert people with the new paradigm in places of public visibility and power. You don't waste time with reactionaries. Rather, you work with active change agents and with the vast middle ground of people who are open-minded. And if you're currently resisting change, then I say that you need to be very careful that you don't end up on the wrong side of history. If you look back at all the major social shifts that have occurred in history, what you find is that the last bastion of resistance has nearly always been old white guys who are indignant about losing their privileges. If you look at the people who are criticizing Greta Thunberg, they are nearly all from that demographic group. Now, you could choose to look at that positively. If that's the only demographic group that is now resisting action on climate change, then maybe we're closer to a tipping point than we think. So if we accept that change can happen, we understand how it happens, how do we maximize our agency to bring about positive change? Well, I've noticed that there is often a tendency to minimize our agency. And perhaps this is true of all humans, I don't know, but certainly I've seen it a lot in architects. We tend to say, well, I'm only an architect. There's not much I can do without a fantastic client. The problem with that is that it encourages others to minimize their agency too. And you can see this at every level in society. Media companies say that they can only produce what their audience wants. CEOs of big companies claim that they are beholden to their shareholders and so on. It has a viral effect on demotivating us. The good news is that the opposite is also true. When we choose to maximize our own agency, we inspire others to do the same. The best way to rise to the challenge of the planetary emergency is to create a rolling wave of agency maximization throughout society. I happen to think we have a lot of influence as architects. We can radically rethink and reuse existing building types so that they're better for people's health and use less energy. We can propose entirely new building types that enhance planetary health. We can choose good clients and turn down shabby ones. We can select teams of polymaths and steer them towards regenerative goals. We don't have to just give clients what they say they want. We can give them what they never dreamed would be possible. We have huge capacity as architects to shape a positive future, far more than many professions. The second shift that Sarah and I talk about in our book is towards co-evolution with nature. So this involves fundamentally rethinking our relationship with the rest of the living world. And one of the most interesting sources on this, I think, is Jeremy Lent's book, The Patterning Instinct. It's genuinely one of the most important books I've read in the last 10 years. And in that book, he describes how metaphors have a very big influence on the way we behave as societies. And he traces the rise of dualism from ancient Greece, when humans were seen as separate from nature and from the gods and so on, through to the philosophy of René Descartes and Francis Bacon, when nature was seen as a machine. And he argues that that is a big part of what has governed our economies since. We treat nature as something to be plundered for resources. And he draws an interesting comparison between Christopher Columbus and Chinese mariner called Admiral Zhang. They were approximate contemporaries. Columbus set sail with a couple of shabby ships and about 90 mariners and unleashed the worst wave of exploitation and plunder in the history of humanity. Admiral Zhang had vastly superior technology. He had a fleet of ships with 25,000 mariners. They visited Africa and the Middle East and Australasia and the Pacific, and they didn't plunder any of those societies. They set up trading relationships and established embassies back in the capital of China at the time. And Jeremy Lent argues that that's because they based their relationship on nature on a very different metaphor. They saw themselves as embedded within a web of living systems, and it simply wouldn't have occurred to them to plunder those societies. And so in this chapter, we argue that this is part of what we need to do. And we argue that adopting a regenerative approach towards nature involves developing a much broader and deeper understanding of place. And a key question when you approach any kind of site is what solutions already exist in this place. And this points both towards radical indigenism, learning from indigenous knowledge, and towards biomimicry, learning from the biological adaptations in that place that have solved many of the challenges that we need to solve as architects. What materials to use, how do we keep warm or cool, how to harvest water. The US-based consultants, Biomimicry 3.8, describe a really inspiring vision based on similar ideas. They say, when you start to design a new piece of city or a new city, what you should do is you start by identifying how a pristine ecosystem in that part of the world functions. How much carbon does it sequester? How much wildlife does it support? How much water does it filter? How much oxygen does it produce? How much food does it produce? And those should become the metrics for your new piece of city. We're nowhere near that at the moment, but I'm absolutely convinced that is possible. That is the future that we can see. The third shift that we describe in the book involves changing the way we think about time. And this is partly about thinking much longer term. I remember the low point in timescales of planning in the late 80s and early 90s. There were hardly any clients that would contemplate a payback period. You know, if it didn't stack up on completion day, forget it. Now you can find some clients that will commit to measures that have maybe a 5 or 10-year payback period, but we need to be thinking much longer term than that. How do we make this shift? Well, a key book here comes from the philosopher Roman Krznaric. It's called The Good Ancestor. And he sets out in this book what it means to think really long term. And we can use some of the ideas from that to raise the level of ambition at the start of a project. If you think of that really critical moment in a project right at the start where everything seems possible, that's the point at which we should be encouraging our clients to think about what kind of legacy they want to leave. Ask them friendly but provocative questions like, what is your long-term purpose? Can there really be many people that would want their legacy to be degenerative? And I'm aware that there's a strong social norm that you should not bring emotional or moral subjects into business meetings, but I believe that's changing. Simplistic cost-benefit analyses are starting to look very morally detached. And there's a really useful exercise created by the environmental author Joanna Macy, and it's called Human Layers, that you can use in workshops to encourage people to think longer term. Part of it involves picturing a young person in your life, thinking about the future they will inherit, and then thinking about them on their 90th birthday. They're at a family gathering, they stand up to give a speech, and just as they're doing that, they see a picture of you on the mantelpiece, and they change their mind, and they decide to give a speech about the legacy you left them. The final stage in the exercise from Joanna Macy is to write that speech. And I've used that in workshops with clients. And we can be pretty sure that 10 or 20 years from now, there will be questions coming from our kids along the lines of, Mum, Dad, what did you do when you knew? I want to be able to look my kids straight in the eye in 20 years and say, yes, I knew what was coming and I did everything I possibly could to change the direction of my profession. I'm proud of what I achieved, but of course, I wish I could have done more. The fourth shift that we describe in our book is from the Anthropocene to the Symbiocene. And this builds on work by people like Rutger Bregman. He wrote a really optimistic and positive book called Humankind, A Hopeful History, in which he dismantled a lot of the sort of myths that we've been telling ourselves about how humans are actually greedy and selfish. And actually, the biological fact is that we are almost unique in our ability to collaborate and demonstrate altruism. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the metaphors and stories we tell ourselves about us have a very big bearing on how we behave. And if the main thing we tell ourselves is that survival of the fittest is the rule that governs humanity, then it will almost inevitably lead to a very divisive form of urbanism. If instead of private luxury and public squalor, which we see so much in the UK and other countries, if instead of that we were to aim for public luxury and private sufficiency, we could create a great quality of life with far less energy and resources. The final shift involves rethinking growth. Conventional economists argue that a healthy level of growth is around 3% a year. What they don't say so clearly is that 3% compound growth from now would result in a doubling of the global economy by 2034 and a doubling again by 2057. We are already breaching a range of planetary boundaries, and to suggest that we can carry on growing indefinitely is absolute madness. We need to distinguish between quantitative and qualitative growth and learn from the way that ecosystems function as dynamic but stable entities that are diverse and abundant and can continue indefinitely. And we also think, my co-author and I, that planetary health should be the aim that we strive for in our economies. Not necessarily well-being, we feel that's rather anthropocentric. Planetary health is a really interesting new perspective. So this refers to the Planetary Health Initiative launched by the medical magazine The Lancet in association with the Rockefeller Foundation. And it argues that human health is inseparable from planetary health. And if we don't realize that, then we could well lose 50 years of health gains. That's the prediction from The Lancet. What I hope is that the pandemic could mark the end of human exceptionalism. The idea that humans are somehow beyond the laws of physics or the realms of biology. I hope that we now see that our future is inseparably connected with the health of the planet. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen now and finish off by talking about Architects Declare. Oops. Excuse me. Sorry, just bear with me. There we go. Right. Sorry. So after we launched UK Architects Declare, we expanded that into Construction Declare so that we can encourage other disciplines. And we were really pleased and energized by the extent to which it had been taken up in other countries. It's now over 6,500 companies in 27 countries. So that's a fantastically energizing and pleasing thing to see. And many of the ideas I mentioned at the beginning, ideas from Donella Meadows about paradigm shifts, these were influential in shaping the declaration points. And since then, the steering group has researched how change happens. And we've worked with two experts from the New Economics Foundation on how to develop a strategy for change. And this is a template that we've used. And we've set out the aim as the first point. That's the aim that we're heading for. And this technique of setting out the aim and then working back from that, of backcasting, this helps to avoid the trap of feeling that all we can do is to incrementally improve on our current reality. So our ambition is to transform the built environment by 2030 so that it is planned, constructed, and operated within planetary boundaries, delivering positive social impacts for all. This is the context that I'm sure we're all familiar with. And we know that the construction industry is a major contributor to the crises. And the curious thing about the age we're living in is that we have all the solutions we need. The main obstacles exist at the level of paradigms or mindsets. So economics based on endless growth, linear resource use, the plundering of nature, and so on. And to shift these rapidly, we think we need a tipping point. And to achieve that, we need 4 things. We need to clearly articulate those shifts. We need the skills to deliver them. We need industry support, and we need public demand. And we've set out various stages in this that will help us achieve this. And I'm very happy to share this with you and receive your feedback. You'd be welcome to adapt this if you want to. We've also set out certain core principles. So the first one is that 30 years of sustainable design has not worked. We need paradigm shifts. Our style is based on calm, evidence-based dialogue. We should advocate what is scientifically necessary rather than what is perceived to be politically possible. We aim to use the collective momentum of signatories to bring about the changes that are difficult to achieve at the level of an individual company or project. And in our communication, we aim to couple scientific truth with implementable action. And this is a summary of that strategy for change. So building again on ideas from Donella Meadows, we're trying to highlight the shortcomings of the existing mindsets, build international cross-disciplinary support for the evolved mindsets. And this has influenced the way we've organized events. So we've often involved kind of paradigm shifting thinkers. At our first event, we had Kate Rayworth talking about donut economics and Jeremy Lent talking about his book, The Patterning Instinct. And then this is the tipping point that we want to achieve by articulating the solutions, developing the skills to deliver them, developing industry support, and building public pressure. And what we aim to do is for the evolved mindsets to become mainstream and for there to be a diminishing license for the outdated mindsets. And now to conclude, really, I just want to say a few things that draw together some of these strands. So you may have detected there's a common thread of biology in what I've been talking about. And rather than imagining that our future lies beyond biology, as Raymond Kurzweil has argued, I believe the best opportunity for shaping a positive future involves looking deeply into biology for the solutions we need, learning from biology, how to build in regenerative ways, learning to participate as nature in a state of co-evolution, learning from biological timescales to become long-term stewards, learning about our deep biological needs to live long, happy, healthy lives in regenerative cities, learning from the abundance of ecosystems to rethink our economic systems. The transformations I've described and the current state of the planet may seem overwhelming, but just look at the prize that's on offer. In our cities, we could create conditions for all of us to be more human than we've ever been, to live in cohesive communities with clean air, healthy food, and a public luxury of shared facilities. We could be the first generation to witness the great return, the return of flora and fauna to our forests, the return of salmon runs to our rivers, and a rewilding of the human spirit. We could see shifting baseline syndrome move in the opposite direction as we increasingly see our roles as co-enablers of life. We could be facilitators of the flourishing of all life for all time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was quite extraordinary. So thank you for sharing that with us. I have a couple questions that were asked in the chat or through message that I just want to bring forward right now to build off of some of that discussion that you presented, or the framework that you presented. So firstly, I think obviously that was a quite well built out framework for engaging change. And I think a few of our questions are really about how do we act on that kind of in our daily lives within practice, right? There's sort of this call for structural change, and then there's a question of what does it actually mean at a firm scale, since our audience is predominantly architects. So I have a question here, which is, what would you say to the 22,000 US firms that have not joined US Architects Declare about how they can join this mission? Will some of them close? If doing better isn't good enough, will they not even try to do better? And that's kind of followed up with a second comment, which is to say, I fully endorse your call to envision an entirely different future, but I'm interested to hear how the many architectural and engineering firms that deliver very ordinary buildings can meaningfully affect change at the level needed.
Okay, so there were several questions.
Mm-hmm.
So what would I say to the the firms that haven't yet joined. Well, we had some interesting feedback from Architects Declare in Canada. They said that quite a lot of the firms signed up because they were worried they wouldn't be able to recruit any young architects if they didn't. And once they had signed up, then they were getting pressure from people within the company that they needed to change. So they started implementing measures. And I think the pressure can come from young people. I think increasingly students at college are, they all know what's going on. They know the future that they're going to inherit if we carry on as they are. And firms that don't get on board with this are going to suffer in the war for talent. Sorry, I don't really like military metaphors, but they're in competition for the best students. And the firms that choose to delay on this, I'm absolutely sure that they will suffer in terms of the quality of the people that they can hire, and very soon the kind of clients that they get as well. We had an event over the last 2 days, and the first speaker, Gabrielle Walker, talked about the amazing shift that is now underway in business. I mean, I know there've been false dawns about this before, and the pace of change has been too slow, but finally now it does seem to be happening, that the big companies are shifting very rapidly. They're getting out of fossil fuels, they're changing their portfolios. I'm actually working as a consultant at the moment for a company that employs 95,000 people. I can't tell you exactly who the company is, but they were definitely an extractive company, and they have fundamentally shifted. They want to now become earth healers. And that has all happened in a couple of years, because last time I engaged with them, they were pretty dismissive of the kind of things I was talking about. So that was the first question. I think the second question was, how do architects implement these ideas? Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Well, I fully acknowledge that I've talked about big transformations, and I wouldn't suggest that you should try to achieve all of those on a single project, because of course it's not going to work. You're just going to be giving yourself a very hard time. But instead, what you can do is you can just try to choose one area where you can really push things, where you can make a difference to people's lives, where you can at least achieve some aspect of regenerative design. Just do the best you can, share your knowledge, share your mistakes and failures and your learnings, and do better next time. And although that might seem insignificant, that is all part of shifting towards a tipping point. And I'm absolutely sure that we will get to a tipping point. Whether we get there soon enough is an open question. But when we get to that tipping point, and it's clear that all clients have to aim for net positive in everything they do, because otherwise they will lose all their shareholders, that's the point at which it'll become much, much easier as architects, because you simply won't have to have such battles with people over the design of your building. So for now, just do the best you possibly can. And be aware of the sort of golden moments in the design process. Those early stages in a new project, that is absolutely the time that you need to try and raise the level of ambition, and use whatever tools you can to encourage your client to think long-term, to make appeals to their kind of good ancestor nature. And by doing that, I really think you can make a difference.
I want to pull something out from the event yesterday too that's been staying with me, which is just how much agency architects have at the beginning stages of projects. And one of the conversations that we could be having is around a project is whether or not that building actually needs to be built. And that, our conversations can start even at that point of a project timeline, and what type of building and the square footage, or if it should be retrofit. And all of those things are places that we have space and time for conversation. I'm going to bring one forward from the chat, which is, how can Architects Declare help a profession truly maximize its agency through collective support for transformative policy, something like the Green New Deal?
That was part of our thinking when we set up Architects Declare, and it's partly why we specifically chose not to charge a subscription, because we wanted to maximize the number of signatories. And that would mean that we could wield more influence when we approach government. So we have written to the British Prime Minister, and we set out a series of very kind of bold policy demands, including the reform of company law, a law of ecocide, a Future Generations Act, a really stretching carbon reduction target, and so on. I think the fact that you've been so successful at garnering lots of signatories means that you have quite a bit of influence now if you approach the government. And as Zan and Lisa will know from our international coordination calls, we have Zoom meetings with Architects Declare instigators from all 27 countries now. And in the build up to COP, we're going to try and kind of coalesce around a common set of demands, because that would be even more influential. You know, if we can say that we have 6,500 companies who in principle agree with these, and this is what we need for the construction industry to rise to the challenge. And I think that, you know, the tone with government is quite an interesting point. And in the early stages, we took quite a lot of advice from people who've been interacting with the British government for quite a long time. And what they said to us was, well, what you need to do is you need to metaphorically knock very politely, and you need to put together a proposal that makes it very easy for the minister to look good. And you know, if they don't accept it, well, tough luck. And the problem with that is that's what people in the environmental movement have been doing with the British government for the last 30 years, and we've got virtually nowhere. And if you look at what Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg did with the British government, is that they metaphorically smashed the door down and literally called them criminals. I'm not suggesting we should do that as Architects Declare, but Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg achieved more in that one-day meeting than we have done in the last 30 years. And that made us think long and hard about the tone that we're adopting with government. And so what we have done is that we've been very direct about the science and about the impacts and about what the construction industry can offer. And the main message that we're getting across is that we as an industry can really rise to this challenge. We have a lot of the solutions necessary to address climate change, climate justice, the biodiversity crisis, but we need you, government, to create the right conditions. And if you don't act, we're going to be turning up the rhetoric. And in the next 6 months, we're seriously considering writing a series of open letters. So for instance, the British Prime Minister passed our letter on to the Minister for Business, Energy, Industry and Skills. He wrote us a very dismissive letter back. We wrote a very robust one back to him. He still refused to meet us. We found out recently that in that time, he has had 150 meetings with fossil fuel companies, or at least his department. And so that will be going in an open letter to The Guardian if he does not consent to a meeting with us. Have I answered your question? I'm not sure.
Thank you very much. Think you have. So thank you so much. We're unfortunately going to have to leave the rest of the questions unanswered, but would encourage those to be sort of sites of discussion moving forward. We have a couple more things to wrap up for today. It'll take about 5 minutes, but thank you everyone for coming in the audience. Michael, everyone for speaking today. And Michael, thank you so much for that presentation. It was really quite inspiring, but also felt very much actionable, which is quite hard to find. And so very much appreciated.
Thank you.
I'm going to pass it over to Chris, Arthi, and Cara, who are going to talk a little bit about our signatory survey, which we're launching today.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that was incredibly inspiring. And I think that what's very clear is that there's been a lot of great work that's been done so far, but we have a lot of work yet to do to transform from declaration into action. And a big part of that is going to be the survey that's forthcoming. That will help us help you as the signatories. We want to aid you in everything that we can possibly do here at US Architects Declare, and so the survey that's coming out is very important to get everyone's feedback. So look for that. Zan posted the link here in the chat, and there's an email coming out as well very soon, and that feedback will be critical. All right, anything you want to add to that?
Well, we're running over time, so I'll just keep it very brief that we are asking some questions a little bit about what you've done in the last year and what you need, just very similar to the questions we were asking Michael. So feel free, there's no wrong answers. It's really about how do we support each other as we're trying to strive for regenerative design. And with that, I'll hand it over to Shannon, and she's going to give us a couple of closing remarks.
Thank you, Arthur. So thank you to everybody for sharing, especially our guest, Michael Pollan. We appreciate you for spending your time with us today. So a year in to launching US Architects Declare, we have a community. I think through our explorations and research efforts, we are making progress, and part of the conversation, and we are a part of the conversation that will change the built environment in practice as we continue to try to make this collective voice. So I hope that everything that was shared today helped the character to what we hope to accomplish, and also spark ideas of how you're able to take part. As you continue to celebrate Earth Day or acknowledge Earth Day, I hope you're encouraged. We continue to aim for urgent change in what feels like a very staid and concrete practice, but we're bold enough to make sure steps forward toward fair, equitable practice. We can think critically about unjust issues in practice, considering each one just as carefully as we would any other complex design problem. We can elevate small voices and share agency. We can work toward a common language that makes tough conversations more accessible. We can share our perspectives, our experience, and our knowledge to cast light on potential barriers to practice and opportunities to overcome them. So to make this goal real, we really need the strength of our signatory firms. We want to hear from firms about your steps in advancing practice. So have you created mission statements? Have you had conversations within your practice about this work? Or maybe you don't even know where to start, but you want to find out. So our hope is that you share your work and experience, and let us find ways to create the urgent change that we want to see. And we can grow. We want more firms, to become signatories, and individuals who have already signed on and those who may in the future to activate inside your own firms to bring these conversations forward. So with that, everyone have an excellent Earth Day. We good? Yeah, you got any comments?
Nope, that's it. Thank you everyone for joining us, for all of our speakers and panelists today, and for the audience. It's really important work that we're all doing, and it's very necessary. So glad to be in this, not fight, but in this movement forward with everyone here. Have a good rest of your day.